Hello, I'm Dr. Alan Goldhamer, the director of the TrueNorth Health Center. Looking forward to sharing with you today some information that I have in working with people with an exclusively plant food diet and our use of medically supervised water-only fasting. First, I'd like to share with you a picture here. This young girl was born about 5 years ago. Just coincidentally happens to be my granddaughter. She was one of 250 million babies born on this planet. But in what may be perhaps the most bizarre statistical anomaly of all times, it turns out that my granddaughter was the cutest one of all. What are the odds of that happening? In the United States today, we spend almost $3 trillion a year on healthcare. We spend almost 2.5 times as much as our colleagues in Europe, and yet, despite spending this tremendous amount of money, it doesn't appear we're getting very good return on our investment. When it comes to important measures like life expectancy, or maybe more importantly, healthy life expectancy, we lag seriously. Life expectancy itself has increased from 47 years in 1900 to 78 years in 2014. That's an increase of 31 years. But adults today live little longer than they did in 1900, with 65-year-olds living only 7 years longer and 85-year-olds living just 2 years longer. So you have to ask, if life expectancy is up 31 years, but adults are only living 7 years longer at age 65. Where's the 24-year difference? And what explains that statistical reality? The fact is, the reason why life expectancy has gone up so much is largely because of a reduction in infant mortality. We've dropped infant mortality from around 160 per thousand in 1900 down to less than 7 per thousand today. And for every child that doesn't die in infancy, you add 78 man years to the average, it shifts the curve to the right. In fact, if you look here, the vast majority of the increase in life expectancy is in fact due to a reduction in infant and childhood mortality, largely as a result of improvements in public health and hygiene, not necessarily tied to medicine. So we believe there's been about 109 billion humans, as we think of ourselves, born, and about 7.3 billion alive today. We have well-documented evidence that approximately 5 humans have lived beyond 117. So the odds of living to beyond 117 right now appear to be about 1 in 20 billion. Obviously a much higher chance that you'll live somewhat shorter than that. The focus wouldn't necessarily be on how to live forever, but how to live until we die. How do we increase healthy life expectancy? Right now, the average person spends 9.4 years in a state of debility and 17 years in poor health. This is the statistics that you can likely do a lot about by adopting health-promoting diet and lifestyles. You will not live forever, but you can dramatically reduce the likelihood that you'll spend the waning years of your life instead of in a high state of enjoyment and productive activity and debility. In 1900, you can see from this chart that the majority of people actually died from infectious diseases. Now, many of these were waterborne illnesses because of the lack of optimum public health. You can see we've dramatically reduced the likelihood of that today. But we still die at more or less similar periods of time, but now it's heart disease, cancer, diabetes that are devastating people. So we talk about the leading cause of death being heart disease, cancer, and stroke. But perhaps a more important consideration are the actual causes of death, the reason why people get heart disease, cancer, and stroke. And the actual causes of death are use of tobacco, alcohol, and poor dietary choices, as well as physical inactivity. According to World Health Organization, tobacco remains the leading cause of death in developed countries. We know that tobacco does an effective job of killing people prematurely because of its ability to affect virtually every organ system in the body. People don't just get lung cancer from smoking. They get heart disease, they get kidney disease, they get all kinds of problems. In fact, they'll tell you that 80% of smokers will never get lung cancer. What they don't tell you is it's because they die so early from heart disease that they don't live long enough to grow their tumors. Blood pressure, you'll notice, is almost as effective as tobacco at killing people prematurely. And then number 3 on the list is alcohol consumption. Unlike what you might discern from listening to the popular media, alcohol is not a health food. In fact, it's a major contributing cause of death. High cholesterol level, largely because it's a marker of animal food intake, being overweight, low fruit and vegetable intake, physical inactivity, and illicit drugs and unsafe sex. You see, these are the things that are actually killing people. So these are the things we have to focus on if we're looking to extend life effectively. Today, probably the dominant syndrome that's debilitating people is classified under metabolic syndrome. So abdominal obesity, high lipids, high triglycerides, high blood pressure, high blood sugar levels with insulin resistance. These are the syndrome that's basically devastating people living in industrialized countries. And we are absolutely getting fatter by the minute. 1986, there wasn't a single state in the country that had identified a BMI greater than 30 in more than 14% of the population. By 1997, they had to add a new color because 20% on these selected states had achieved obesity. By 1999, obesity was spreading almost epidemically. In 2001 and 2004, you can see we had to add 25% to the chart because obesity was becoming so rampant, particularly here in this part of the country. Another new color came about in 2005 when, with diligent effort, over 30% of the state, these three states achieved obesity. By 2010, you can see this obesity continued to spread, and this is absolute proof that somebody at the Center for Disease Control is truly an optimist. Because although no state had broken the 35% goal at achieving obesity in 2011, they actually put it on the graph here, anticipating that there would be a breakthrough. And sure enough, 1 year later, that was achieved. It's actually not just the United States that's suffering an epidemic of obesity. It's actually worldwide. There's now more people suffering and dying as a consequence of dietary excess than deficiency. But I'm proud to say, as an American, when it comes to achieving obesity, we're perhaps number one. We've done a more effective job of putting fat on the waist and hips of Americans than just about anybody else. And if you look here, in Asia, where there's still only 3% or so obesity, it's kind of like they're not even trying. Besides getting fatter, we're also getting sicker. And if you look at the correlation between increased obesity, increase of conditions like diabetes, you see there's a very strong relationship, almost a one-to-one relationship. It's almost as if there's a connection. So what we're doing about it is trying to sell people health foods. Things like olive oil, red wine, dark chocolate, coffee, animal products. And of course, this is going to fail. What we need to do is start talking about healthy foods. And health food is not healthy food. Healthy foods are fresh fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. And that's going to turn out to be the pathway to success. To understand how we've gotten into this problem and we've made such a mess of things, it helps to think back to where we come from and who we are as humans. We evolved in an environment of scarcity where it was so difficult to get enough to eat and avoid being eaten that most of our ancestors did not succeed at that. They died in infancy or childhood. They died before they could live long enough to reproduce. Thus, they did not pass on their genes or their DNA. And they are not your ancestors. Your ancestors were the few that did manage to get enough to eat and avoid being eaten. And they did this because they had certain characteristics that allowed them to survive this harsh environment of scarcity in which they evolved. Now, humans survived in part because we had fabulous adaptive capacities. We've been using tools apparently for as much as 1 million years or more. We learned to use fire to process our foods and provide light, heat, and protection for at least 500,000 to 700,000 years or more. And about 100,000 years ago, humans discovered perhaps the most powerful tool the planet's ever seen, which is language, which allowed us to accumulate information and pass it on in a geometric fashion, and ultimately was responsible for helping us really survive and thrive. Here's a picture of a modern human brain, and here's a representation of an ancient human brain 100,000 years ago. And if you'll notice, they're identical. According to the anthropologists, in the last little blip of biological time, that is the last 100,000 years, there has not been any discernible change in size, capacity, or function of the human brain. And that's an important consideration because although we go farther back in our history, you can see humans were smaller, brains were smaller. Since modern humans appear on the scene, about the same time overlapping there with Neanderthals, we can see that there has not been an appreciable change in brain or physical stature. The important consideration is that your brain is the same brain that your ancestors 100,000 years ago had, and that brain evolved to survive an environment of scarcity. It was not designed for the environment that we live in today, and it's not had enough biological time in order to adapt effectively. So we're designed for this environment, but we live in this environment. And that has profound implications, not the least of which involves our dietary choices. The way the brain gets the body to do what it needs to do to survive and ultimately reproduce is essentially neurochemically mediated. The brain secretes a neurochemical, a neuroprotein called dopamine, and dopamine induces a response that you and I experience as pleasure. The more dopamine, the more pleasure. So every time humans engaged in behaviors that favored survival and reproduction in their natural setting, the brain was rewarding the body with dopamine. And that system worked really good. It favored the two most critical behaviors necessary for human survival, which is getting enough to eat and engaging in sexual activity to ensure procreation. So basically, food and sex. Food and sex are the only normal natural stimulants of concentrated dopamine, at least unless you're a male human, then of course it's completely different. Then it would be, well, sex and food. But whether it's food and sex or sex and food, these normal natural stimulants of dopamine work well to ensure that human beings engaged in the eating behavior and the sexual behavior necessary for the survival of our species. Being the big innovators and creative geniuses that we are as humans, we actually discovered, though, that there are ways to artificially stimulate dopamine production in our brains. And one of those ways is using certain chemical substances, not the least of which is alcohol. People like to drink because they like the way it makes them feel, in part because it stimulates dopamine production in the brain. We discovered it wasn't just alcohol, though. There were other chemicals that could be used to artificially stimulate dopamine in the brain. Things like methamphetamines. People also found they could inject materials into their veins. They could use material like this, which, although it looks like cheese, is not. That actually is crack cocaine. Cocaine turns out to be a particularly efficient way of artificially stimulating dopamine in the brain. Rats given access to cocaine will continue to access that cocaine till they're dead because it is so powerfully reinforcing. In fact, if you quantify the effect of cocaine on the human brain, you compare how much dopamine is secreted when you're smoking cocaine compared to having an orgasm during sex, you'll find there's actually 10 times as much cocaine from smoking cocaine as having an orgasm. I remember I was giving a talk one time in Los Angeles to a large group of people. I was talking about this topic. And an older woman, probably in her mid-80s, interrupted me and she said, "Excuse me, Dr. Goldhamer, where do you get cocaine?" But that's not the point. The point is that this is an artificial stimulation that dopamine response leads to an addictive process. And if that was the end of the story, we could just say, well, just say no to drugs. Drugs can be a problem. But it's not that simple because it turns out there's chemicals that can actively be added, for example, to the feed of animals that will artificially stimulate dopamine in the animal's brain and lead to consistent and systematic overeating. For example, mice or rats fed ad libitum will get to a certain size, but put some of these chemicals in the rat chow, those rats will increase their weight 40% in just 60 days. So you get huge increases in relatively short periods of time as a consequence of fooling the brain of the rat to stimulate more dopamine that leads to consistent overeating. It turns out it's not just mice and rats and birds that are vulnerable to this effect or to these chemicals. It turns out that this also works in people. And one of the chemicals that you can add to the chow of animals or people that will lead to overeating is C6H12O6, which we all recognize is sugar. Refined carbohydrates don't exist in nature in a concentrated form. You have to actually manufacture them. We do an effective job of that to the point where today people are consuming 150 pounds a year of sugar on average. Now, I don't eat any of it, which means somebody's taking my share as well. And there's one particularly obnoxious form of sugar, which is high fructose corn syrup, which is actually heavily federally subsidized, which we have increased consumption over 1,000% since 1986. Now, I'm sure that this massive increase in sugar and things like high fructose corn syrup may in fact be related to the epidemic rise in obesity that's happened over much the same time. There's also another chemical that you can add to the chow of animals or people that will increase their weight consistently, and that's this chemical, which we all know of as oil. Also, not a normal substance that you find in nature. You don't fall into oil ponds. What you do is you have to manufacture this by tearing cells apart, taking out the concentrated constituent of the cell, and then putting it into liquid form. Whether it's olive oil, coconut oil, or any other oil, oil is oil. All have 4,000 calories a pound and result in unfortunate consequences when they're consumed. In fact, what we do with oil is particularly obnoxious. We'll find a deep fryer, increase the oil at high temperature, and then use it to use things like potatoes to soak up the grease. We call it French fries and potato chips. I suggest to my patients, instead of eating French fries and potato chips, probably they should just find the deep fryer and stick their head in it and suck, because that's essentially what they're doing when they're eating foods like that. And believe me, it's having an effect on us in a major way. In fact, now we're looking at epidemic increases, particularly amongst children, of conditions like diabetes. At this point, we've been so effective at inculcating people with the pleasure trap that 93% of all the calories consumed in industrialized countries come from either animal foods, things like meat, fish, fowl, eggs, and dairy products, or highly processed, highly refined foods like oil, sugar, and of course, plenty of added salt as well. 7% of calories come from fruits and vegetables, but of that, a third of it's the potatoes, mostly served in French fries and potato chips. So at this point, I think whole natural foods really don't even hardly make a statistically significant percentage of the diet of people living in industrialized countries. It's not surprising when you go out, sometimes it's hard to find healthy things to eat. So we call it the pleasure trap. Just coincidentally also happens to be the title of Dr. Lyle and my's book, The Pleasure Trap, Mastering the Hidden Force That Undermines Health and Happiness. Basically, our contention is that the reason why people are fat and sick is because they're artificially stimulating dopamine in their brain with the use of highly processed chemicals they put in their diet, and it needs to stop. One of the consequences of the pleasure trap, particularly the dietary pleasure trap, is people have not only obesity, but they also have an epidemic of high blood pressure or hypertension. In fact, by the time you reach 65, if you do not have hypertension, you're actually abnormal, because the majority of people will actually achieve high blood pressure by this age, if they survive that long. And the way we treat it, of course, is with a variety of pills and potions and powders. And the thing that's interesting about medical management of high blood pressure, one of the leading contributing causes of death and disability, is that the physician will tell you, look, here's the drugs you take, and you'll need to take these drugs for the rest of your life. For the rest of your life. How does your doctor know when they prescribe high blood pressure medication that you'll need to take the drugs the rest of your life? They know because what they're telling you is, we guarantee you, if you do what you're told, you'll never get well. You'll be sick forever. Because, of course, high blood pressure medications don't deal with the underlying reason why you're developing hypertension, which is largely because of the choices you make about what you put in your mouth. So to understand blood pressure, you need to remember that it's measured with two numbers. The top number, or systolic blood pressure, represents the pressure of your blood in the vessels when your heart contracts. And the diastolic, or bottom number, represents the pressure of your blood vessels when the heart's in its relaxed mode. What's interesting about blood pressure measurements is they're very sensitive indicators of all-cause mortality. The higher your blood pressure, the higher your risk of dying from all causes. High blood pressure and the conditions that are caused by it, particularly things like we're showing here, congestive heart failure and stroke, are really killing a significant percentage of the people that are dying prematurely. And high blood pressure is the single biggest preventative factor associated with congestive heart failure and the single biggest preventative factor associated with stroke. As I mentioned, most people will develop high blood pressure in their lifetime. It's worth tens of billions of dollars to the pharmaceutical and medical institutions, because you realize it's the leading justification for prescription medications, responsible for tens of millions of visits to physicians. What's interesting is that drug intervention is largely disappointing in terms of improved outcomes, except for those people with the highest levels of hypertension. But the majority of heart attacks and strokes actually caused by high blood pressure actually occur in people that you don't normally medicate, because more people would die from taking the medications from the underlying condition. For example, a patient with a blood pressure of 130/88 may have a higher risk from being medicated than not, unless they have end organ target disease, but they still have 5 times the risk of a heart attack compared to a person with a blood pressure of 110/70. And for every point you reduce your systolic blood pressure through diet and lifestyle change, you reduce your risk of all-cause mortality, that is death from any cause, by 1%. And that risk goes down all the way to about 90/60. So even though average blood pressures may be much higher than that, healthy blood pressures probably closer to 90/60. We know that there's a number of things you can do to lower blood pressure: weight loss, adopting a vegetarian high-fiber diet, not drinking, exercising. Medications do reduce blood pressure, and they may reduce the risk of stroke for people with the higher levels of hypertension, but they come with a cost, including chronic cough, fatigue, impotence, and potentially death. Aggressive salt restriction, as we advocate, where you're getting a 0.5 milligram or maybe as much as 1 milligram of sodium per calorie, is very powerful in reducing blood pressure in a significant percentage of people. John McDougall at St. Helena Hospital published a study showing a 17-point average effect by combining these variables. And with the help of Dr. T. Colin Campbell from Cornell University, we actually published a study that showed an average drop of 37 points when we incorporated fasting into the mix. And in fact, this paper that we published in JMPT demonstrated the largest effects that have ever been shown in treating hypertension, with an average effect size in stage 3 hypertension of over 60 points. So the average patient that came in with blood pressure starting at 180 or higher was able to drop their blood pressure an average of 60 points, plus whatever effect their medication was having, because they all started, all of those that started on medications were off medications by the completion of this study. We also published a second paper a couple years later looking at borderline hypertension, so people that had high blood pressure enough to increase the risk of dying, but not so high to justify the risk of medications, and these patients responded proportionally as well. At that point, we actually got involved with the International Union of Operating Engineers. We signed a contract offering our care to their members, and we're able to set up a study where we looked at the first 30 consecutive union members that they sent in. During their average 3-week stay, they dropped 26 pounds, and on follow-up, ranging up to a year later, they were down 28 pounds, which means, they'd done pretty well at maintaining their improvement during fasting. Their blood pressure that was down 30/11 during fasting was down 27/10 on follow-up. And of course, the thing the union was excited about, we showed that the average savings to the union was greater in 1 year than the entire cost of the program. What was interesting is I remember the very first gentleman that they sent me from the union, they had told their membership that this was a fully covered benefit. They told this particular individual that he couldn't work until he brought his blood pressure down more and to come to us and we'd help him. He was at the time on 5 blood pressure medications. He was coming in, but they failed to tell him the nature of the program. They didn't tell him about the vegetarian diet or the fasting or any of the things that we did. When he arrived, he was a little surprised. He looked around and he said he thought he was in the wrong place. I assured him that he was in the right place and he was here to get well. And he assured me that he wasn't sick, that yes, his blood pressure was 220/120, but that he felt just fine. I suggested that he wasn't fine, that he had high blood pressure. He also had diabetes. He was overweight. And that, that was going to lead to his premature death. His response to me was, well, don't we all have to die sometime anyway? I responded in the affirmative, but I suggested that perhaps if we got him healthy, he might benefit from the reduction in the $885 a month of medications that he was taking. He told me that it didn't matter because his union paid for his drugs. And it was at that point I realized this wasn't my normal self-selected, highly conscientious, self-motivated individual, and I wasn't quite sure what to do with him. But I thought about his medical history, and as you know, males that are on a lot of high blood pressure and diabetes medication often suffer from a common problem of impotence. And so what I said to him was, I said, you know, if we get you off all these drugs and get you healthy, then we may be able to do something about your wound problem. He started to stand up, and at that point I realized I may have made a tactical error because he was a pretty big guy, and he said, well, why the hell didn't you just say so? So we're checking him in, and he was telling me about his diet diary. He basically ate this. Now, it wasn't exactly this because I couldn't get a picture of a triple cheeseburger without a piece of that disgusting green stuff called lettuce, because he said he would never eat that. If they made a mistake and put that on his hamburger, he would lift up the bun, take that off, and throw it away. So given that his diet was essentially meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, oil, salt, and sugar, we decided we would try to feed him a bit before we instituted the fasting in order to address his underlying condition. We gave him his first meal, and at first I was watching him try to eat this meal, and he's like, and I thought, oh, perhaps he had a tumor we missed. I asked him if he was having difficulty with the food, and he said, what food? He said, this food that we had given him, the fruit, the vegetables, was not food. He said it was disgusting. And he told me that if he had to eat tasteless slime like that the rest of his life, he'd rather just die. He suggested that I go out to his truck, get his 12 gauge, and when he's not looking, just shoot him in the head. So we checked him in. He underwent a fast of somewhat over 20 days, during which time he normalized his blood pressure and blood sugar levels. He obviously lost a lot of weight. What was most interesting to me, it was afterwards we were going through the refeeding process, and now he was actually eating the food. And when I asked him, I said, it looks like you're doing a little better with the food now. He said, yeah, your damn chef's finally getting the hang of it. It took me like 20 minutes to convince him that it was the same food we gave him before, but now he'd gone through a process we call neuroadaptation, and he could actually enjoy eating whole natural foods. One of the things you want to think about, this gentleman, if I just sent him home with a note suggesting he adopt a healthy diet, would not have complied. He would not have even been able to get through a single meal. After the impact of fasting, we were able to get good compliance. It was interesting. I saw him about 6 months later at a semi-annual where we were doing blood pressure screening. I asked him how he was doing. He said, I'm doing just fine. And he actually did maintain good dietary compliance despite the fact that he had a long way to come. Now, what we did with him that was unique is we went through a period of fasting. Now, right now, there's a lot of information in the popular literature about various forms of fasting, not the least of which is various forms of calorie restriction or intermittent fasting or periodic fasting. Now, that's not what I'm talking about today. These are very useful tools for intermittent fasting, for example, where you narrow the feeding window of an individual. Maybe they don't eat breakfast before a certain time in the morning or dinner after a certain time in the afternoon to increase the fasting window of time, or reducing calories to 600 calories a day, 1 or 2 days a week. These types of programs can be very helpful. We describe them in detail on our website at healthpromoting.com for people that want to learn about that. We've got all the information freely available for you. But what I'm talking about today is actually medically supervised water-only fasting. And that's going to be periods of water-only fasting in a controlled environment for anywhere from 5 to 40 days. This is different than starvation, which is often used synonymously in the literature with the term fasting. Fasting is when you have labile reserves. You can mobilize necessary nutrient stores. If you go long enough, then you enter a process called starvation. If you continue starvation, well, then you die. That would be something we don't do because it would be really bad for our outcome data. Interestingly enough, though, even a thin male, a 70-kilogram male, has about with 18% body fat, could fast probably around 70 days in an environment of rest before depleting their reserves. Now, even moderate activity will double energy expenditure and concomitant protein use. So it is important in fasting from a clinical viewpoint that rest be a part of the program. 4 phases of fasting include the gastrointestinal phase, where you eat up what's in your digestive system. Once you've used up the stuff in your digestive system, you either have to eat again, or you begin glycogenolysis, where you're mobilizing glycogen stores in order to free up the sugar that your brain and body needs in order to carry on essential functions. Eventually, you will deplete the glycogen stores. You know, if you go out and run a marathon, about 20 miles, they call it running into the wall. In part, that's because you've depleted your glycogen stores. Then you enter a process called gluconeogenesis. This is the conversion of protein, rather inefficiently, to providing glucose that you need to carry on vital functions. All the while, your body is shifting from burning sugar to burning fat. You go into a process of ketosis, and most specifically, beta-hydroxybutyric acid becomes the primary fuel of the brain. Now, that's a unique adaptation of humans. Humans can fast. Humans can change from burning primarily glucose to burning primarily fat. Not all animals can do that. For example, chimpanzees, that we share so many components of our DNA with, do not fast. That may be in part why they've never wandered away from the tropics, unlike humans. Were it not for the biological adaptation that humans have to be able to fast, the first time spring came late, all the humans that wandered away from the tropics would have died. We didn't because we have this biological adaptation. Essentially, the biochemistry of fasting is about how to draw your, on your fat stores, use your protein, and conserve your nutrient resources. We know that indications for fasting vary, but the most obvious indication of fasting is the loss of appetite that characterizes acute disease. We can use it in chronic illness, we can use it to speed healing, we can use it to help people change behaviors. For example, quitting smoking. Most people after 2 or 3 days of fasting no longer experience withdrawal effects commonly associated with smoking. Some people claim that's because they're so uncomfortable fasting, they're not thinking about it, but it's not actually true. And of course, it is interesting that there's almost no known major religion that doesn't have some type of tradition with fasting. Important thing of fasting is patient selection. Not everybody's a candidate for fasting. So in order to determine who is a good candidate, we need a complete medical history, a physical exam, and laboratory evaluations. It's critically important to establish baseline data so you can ultimately tell the difference between a healing crisis, which is a positive thing, and a problem, which can be a seriously bad or even deadly thing. So it's important that people understand that medically supervised fasting is something that we're talking about now and needs to be done in a controlled environment. Intermittent fasting, other modified fasting can often be done by people with less supervision and support, but this is something that's done in a controlled setting. The general experience of fasting is very interesting. Things like a foul taste in the mouth are common, as we call it faster's mouth. Oftentimes, particularly in people that are coming off animal-based diets or people that are using drugs or on medications, will get a foul taste in the mouth that tastes like something crawled in there and died. Increased body odor, sometimes so intense you don't even want to be in the same room with yourself. You can also experience fatigue, sometimes profound episodes of fatigue, sleep disturbance, restlessness and irritability. If you think people don't get irritable sometimes in fasting, just come to the TrueNorth Health Center and look at where we have maybe 50 or 60 people fasting. You take away their drugs, you take away their alcohol, you take away their food, and sometimes people get a little grumpy. That's certainly a common experience in fasting. Dizziness or orthostatic hypotension has to be managed properly, where you move around slowly so that you don't pass out. Aches and pains, nausea, vomiting, rashes, and discharges are all common experiences during fasting as the body mobilizes and eliminates accumulated intermediate products of metabolism in the attempt to try to get well. There's usually heightened senses and, of course, the healing crisis. These healing crises are problems where chronic problems become acute and oftentimes, sometimes uncomfortable, and then the chronic problem resolves and then everybody is quite forgiving. To people not familiar with fasting, this list of general experiences may not seem particularly attractive. For those of us that are used to fasting, we see these things as generally positive signs that tells us that the body's doing its job of mobilizing and eliminating products that aren't supposed to be there. I remember I had a patient referred to me by a physician in Clear Lake, and she was a woman with arthritis and hypertension on a lot of medications, and she came in and she told me that her medical doctor had referred her for treatment of her conditions and that we could help her. And she said she loved her doctor. She'd known him for over 20 years. She had absolute faith in him, but she said he was a bit of a kidder. And he said that the treatment that we were going to do, he said, was to put her in a room and not feed her for 2 weeks. And she thought that was the funniest thing that she'd ever heard. I explained to her it would probably be more like 3 weeks. She asked me what would happen to her if she ate nothing but water only for over 3 weeks. And I explained to her that she'd probably get a foul taste in her mouth and have fatigue and sleep disturbances, restlessness, and irritability. She may have some nausea, vomiting, rashes, discharges, and perhaps a healing crisis. At that point, she interrupted me and she said, "Well, Ma, you're quite the salesman. Where do I sign up?" She did actually quite well. I believe she fasted 26 days with us and went back to see her physician when she was done. And when she came into his office, he told me that it was, in his experience, it was the most amazing thing he'd seen in 25 years of medical practice. He immediately called me on the phone. And he said, and he could hardly believe what he was seeing, but the thing he didn't quite understand is that she said that we had fasted her for over 3 weeks on water only. And he wanted to know how we got her to do it. So I thought I'd give him a hard time. And I said, well, you know, she was so reluctant that we finally realized the only hope was to just tie her up. And he said, you did not. And then he turned to her and he said, did they tie you up? And she said, well, not till after the second week. Interestingly enough, he left his practice, joined our staff until he retired from the practice of medicine. He said he wanted to do something worthwhile in the remaining years of his career. Fasting duration ranges from a few days to a few weeks. Sometimes it'll take several fasts to resolve a problem, depending on how persistent it is. And it's not always possible to know exactly how long we should recommend, and so we often try to let the body decide based on how it's doing and book people on an open-ended basis. You know, it's a little bit bizarre if you think about it, that doing essentially nothing, like fasting, can have the most powerful effect on the leading contributing cause of death and disability, like conditions like high blood pressure and diabetes and autoimmune disorders and some forms of cancer. So you have to start asking, what's going on in fasting that allows these conditions to heal? And in fact, there's other people asking those same questions, including drug companies that are actually sponsoring research right now, trying to figure out how it is that these things in animal and humans are able to change during fasting. What are the mechanisms? What's going on? Because what the drug companies would like to do is come up with what are called fasting mimic drugs. Drugs that would create in the body the same changes that are created by fasting, but without actually having to do the fasting. And of course, those drugs, if they had the results that fasting have, would be very valuable medications. So what are the mechanisms that happen in fasting? What's going on in fasting? We know weight loss happens in fasting. In fact, everybody that fasts loses weight. And average weight loss is about a pound a day. Everybody that fasts experiences this natriuretic process where the body selectively mobilizes and eliminates a lot of the accumulated sodium that's built up in the body, often because we eat diets that are excessively high in salt. Along with the excess salt that's eliminated is the excess fluid that's kept to keep the body from being damaged by the toxic effect of salt. And so the blood volume goes down along with blood pressure, the edema, the swelling, a lot of the joint pain, the congestive heart failure, and other symptoms oftentimes are dramatically and often very quickly improved during fasting. Detoxification, the idea that the body has toxins in it, has been proven correct. There are several hundred chemicals that have now been identified that accumulate at various levels inside the cells of the human organism and can eventually become part of the limiting factor and even part of the aging process itself. When they do studies where they'll take fat and break it down and then break down analyze for the chemicals, they find various concentrations in virtually every human being. Or if they take cadavers, liquefy the tissues and then analyze for these toxins, they find they're virtually universal, whether it's PCB and dioxin and mercury and all kinds of other heavy metals and toxic pesticide residues, etc. It's interesting, though, if you ask, how did those toxins get inside those cells? Obviously, smoking and drinking and using drugs are an obvious factor. But interestingly enough, as much as 90% of certain toxins in the cells got there from one common human behavior, and that's the consumption of animal foods. Animals biologically concentrate the poisons from their environment and their diets and their treatment in their cells, so they build up week after month after year. So when you kill and eat an animal or drink and smoke, you get its entire lifetime accumulation of toxins all in one mouthful. And so just by choosing to adopt a vegan diet free of animal products, you eliminate a major source of potential toxins that are rapidly and efficiently mobilized and eliminated during fasting. Now, some people have criticized fasting, thinking that the body doesn't know what it's doing, and it wouldn't mobilize and eliminate toxins effectively or efficiently. It might be too much, and therefore you should never fast because you wouldn't want to have those toxins being elaborated in the system for processing and elimination. That has not been our experience, and we have objective evidence that, in fact, the body does a really good job of effectively mobilizing and eliminating these toxic materials, and total body loads do drop after fasting. Autophagy is also the process which the cells in the body go through eating up things like bacteria and viruses and cancer cells and other things. And that process of autophagy seems to be significantly enhanced during fasting. In fact, in a study that we're going to be doing here very shortly, along with our colleague Luigi Fontana, we're going to be looking at this. They can now actually measure this very accurately in T lymphocytes. And so we'll be looking at before and after fasting to measure the effect quantitatively that this has. Multipotential hemopoietic stem cells are kind of in the news right now because these stem cells are the primordial cells that become all the other cells, as we see here. And it was thought that hemopoietic stem cells dysfunction was a major source of morbidity and mortality. It was thought to be irreversibly damaged by aging. And the sensitivity of these hemopoietic stem cells is a limiting factor in cancer treatment, because if you give an animal enough chemotherapy to kill each and every cancer cell, which is what you need to do to make sure they don't come back, you tend to also kill the animal, which is, not really good. So the research done by Luigi Fontana at USC showed that if you take rats with cancer and you give them enough chemotherapy to kill all the cancer cells, you also kill all the rats. But if you take the same kind of rats with the same kind of cancer and the same kind of treatment, but you fast the rats before, during, and after the chemotherapy treatment, the rats survive. And he says it's a profound way of reversing the aging of the immune system and enhancing cancer treatment with a dramatic increase in survival in those animals where fasting is utilized. So again, tremendous interest in how is it that fasting does that, with the hope, of course, that it might be mimicked. Cancer theories are interesting. Differential stress resistance and differential stress sensitization deals with the fact that cancer cells, perhaps owing to their higher metabolic rate, are more vulnerable in the fasting state than are healthy cells, normal cells. Normal cells, because fasting is a biological adaptation, have the ability to deal with the fasting state. Cancer cells do not. And that may be why cancer cells are much more vulnerable to conventional chemotherapy. And also, just fasting itself may be responsible for turning off some of the factors associated with both aging and cancer development. According to this article in Journal of Metabolism, combination of fasting and chemotherapy results in dramatically higher cancer-free survival than chemotherapy. There's also mitochondrial benefits. We mentioned beta-hydroxybutyrate, which increases in fasting and provides antioxidant and rejuvenative benefits, both to the mitochondrial function. It also results in ATP production, enhancing antiviral immunity. So some of these chronic viral infections that seem to be so resistant and, of course, are not at all responsive to antibiotics may respond to the body's natural mechanisms enhanced by the fasting state. In lower eukaryotes, we know that you can take simple cell organisms and put them in a nutrient deficit environment. Their life expectancy goes up 400% because they go into kind of a hibernation mode, waiting for a new source of nutrition. We know that fasting in studies with rodents will protect against diabetes, cancer, heart disease, and neurodegeneration, changes in the brains associated with conditions like Alzheimer's disease. In humans, we've got studies looking at reducing obesity. Our data, which he cites here in hypertension, asthma, and rheumatoid arthritis. And we know that fasting can delay aging by protecting against the diseases of dietary excess. So increasing evidence becoming available, what a powerful healing effect can happen when fasting is used appropriately. I'd like to share with you a study that we recently had published in the British Medical Journal. This is a 42-year-old female diagnosed with follicular lymphoma, which is lymph cancer. This was stage 3, had been confirmed by excisional biopsy. This is a rather advanced stage of this condition. The current treatment protocols include immunotherapy-based treatments, chemotherapy, and radiation, but none of them have been shown to be dramatically effective. And so there's often a delay in imposing these treatments because of their side effects until it's absolutely necessary. CAT scan of this individual was positive. She underwent a CT-guided core biopsy, and the data was presented. Her primary care physician, interestingly enough, was not exactly supportive in the sense that he told her that there was no evidence that diet played a role in her condition, that she could eat whatever she wanted, and he described fasting as criminal quackery. Her oncologist wasn't quite so antagonistic. He told her that diet wasn't relevant to the condition, that there was no evidence that fasting would be helpful, and that his recommendation was conventional therapy. So given that tremendous medical support, she decided to check in at the TrueNorth Health Center to wait 21 days of water-only fasting. And during that time, her externally palpable tumors disappeared. She underwent 10 days of refeeding and then went back to the oncologist, who was rather surprised. He examined her a couple times, looked at her chart, looked at her picture, examined her again, and then he asked her what happened, and she explained that she'd gone to the criminal quacks, underwent the fasting, and her tumors disappeared. He was rather impressed, suggested to her that he'd give us a call, and then suggested that she come back in a few months for follow-up. She asked him for a follow-up CT scan, and he told her that it really wasn't necessary because she was better. She persisted, he relented, got the follow-up CT. And at 12-month follow-up, not only had she maintained her progress, but her white counts and everything else had normalized. She was doing very well. And at this point, we decided it was time to submit this study for publication. My colleague, John McDougall, suggested a few journals. I told him I wanted to submit it to the British Medical Journal. He didn't think that was a realistic suggestion. He thought we needed to be, at a little bit lower impact journal. So I immediately sent it to the British Medical Journal, of course. And fortunately for us, they decided to publish the paper. I wrote to the oncologist. I told him I thanked him very much for all the confidence he had shown in referring his patient to us for therapeutic water-only fasting. And I said that I am sure as I'm sure he expected, she's obviously gone into remission and continues to do well. And I invited him to sign on as co-author of the paper since he was her oncologist. It's been 2 years. I still haven't heard from him. I'm sure it's just because he's busy. In any case, we now have a 2-year follow-up on her, and she's continued to do very well, probably not in small part because she's been compliant with our exclusively plant food diet, free of SOS. SOS, of course, stands for the International Symbol of Danger, and also sugar, as well as refined carbohydrates, oil, and added salt. These were the CAT scans before. You can see here a pretty good sized mass, before and after. And this was, interesting enough, her weight and BMI. You notice her weight before we started was 81 kilograms, started the fast 78 kilograms, end of the fast 68 kilograms, 6-month follow-up 63, 12-month follow-up 59, and then at 24 months, I don't have that on here, but it's gone down a little bit more. And that's just evidence that she's actually being compliant. The problem with these approaches is you actually have to do the things like eat good, exercise, and get enough sleep in order to sustain the results. Because just like obesity, you can't cure obesity, you can manage it. If you go back to greasy, fatty, slimy, dead, decaying flesh, highly processed foods, you're going to get fat again. You're not curing cancer or high blood pressure or anything else. What you're doing is you're managing it. You're changing the diet and lifestyle. The fact that the body's ability to heal itself is getting faster, quicker than it's getting sick, and that works well in highly compliant patients. Other mechanisms of fasting include enzymatic induction. Enzymes are necessarily generated by the body to do things like detoxification and fat mobilization, etc. These enzyme systems of detoxification are induced during fasting, and we believe they persist after fasting. So you're not just detoxifying when you fast, but you actually continue to detox at a faster rate after fasting, and we believe it's cumulative. That every time somebody fasts, we believe we're canalizing these pathways, and we believe that we're going to find evidence in this research that we're beginning now that's going to show that those systems persist. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor and its receptor also increase in fasting and exercise. The higher the BDNF levels, the lower the risk factors associated with neurological disorders, including things like dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Insulin is a hormone that drives sugar from the bloodstream into the cells. Insulin resistance, which is the characteristic hallmark of type 2 diabetes, improves during fasting. So it is not something that particularly responds well to drugs, but it does respond to fasting. And that's why a significant percentage of our type 2 diabetics are able to achieve normal blood sugar levels without medication, as long as they're willing to do really dangerous and radical things like eat good and exercise on an ongoing basis. The gut is a tunnel that goes through your body. It starts in your mouth, it ends at the anus. Digestion is essentially shoving stuff in one hole and eventually trying to push it out the other hole. Just because you swallow something doesn't mean it's in your body. It's actually going through your body. And unless it's able to get through the small mesh that's created by the gut lining, represented here by a screen, it will never enter your body. It'll just go in one hole and out the other. If it's small enough, for example, if it's a glucose molecule or an amino acid, it can get through the microbial mesh that's created by the gut. However, most of these larger molecules, including peptide molecules, cannot penetrate the gut membrane unless the gut membrane is damaged. Much like flies are kept out by a screen, if the screen is damaged, the flies get in. If your intestinal mucosal membrane is damaged, you can get what's called gut leakage, where proteins are absorbed into the system that aren't designed to be there. Fortunately, you have an immune system. The immune system reacts, takes care of it, and you're fine, unless you continue to assault the body with ongoing sources of amino acids or proteins that are antagonistic or antigenic, in which case, in genetically vulnerable people, the immune system can overreact, and depending on what tissues your body is attacking will be the name of the condition we call it. If it's attacking your colon, it might be called ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. If it's your skin, you might term it vasculitis. If your thyroid is being attacked, we might call it Hashimoto's thyroiditis, etc. So the idea is that one thing that all of these autoimmune diseases have in common is that they are caused by your immune system attacking your own tissues. And one of the triggers that's thought to be a part of this may be gut leakage. And what causes gut leakage may be contributed to by free radicals. So free radicals that damage the animal lining lead to gut leakage. Eat proteins that lend themselves, like dairy proteins or gluten, etc. Those proteins get absorbed. The body's immune system reacts in some people inappropriately. It attacks your own tissues. The medical management, shut down the immune system. Take powerful drugs like prednisone or methotrexate, which at first can seem like a dream because your symptoms go away. And then it can become a nightmare because it turns out you need your immune system. And when you shut your immune system down with corticosteroids, eventually there's a huge price to be paid. Free radicals cause all kinds of damage. For example, if you look here, the difference between one face and another would be free radicals from maybe smoking. Smoking is a fabulous source of free radicals. It bathes the tissues of the body with free radicals, not just causing smoker's face that you see here, but also damaging the animal lining of the blood vessels leading to heart disease, as I mentioned before, which may be why people get so much heart disease they don't live long enough to ultimately grow the tumors they might have grown otherwise. Fasting also reboots the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is the part of the nervous system that controls the things you don't normally think about. Like, for example, if you run, your heart has to beat faster. If it doesn't, you'd have a serious problem. You don't have to worry about it, though, because the autonomic nervous system does that for you. It stimulates increased pulse so that you're able to pump the blood. Well, the balance between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system is important. If it's out of balance, you may get symptoms. For example, if the sympathetic nervous system is set too high, you might have constipation. If the parasympathetic nervous system is too high, you might have symptoms like diarrhea. We've invented hundreds of healing systems to try to rebalance the autonomic nervous system, not the least of which are things like meditation and biofeedback, homeopathy, and chiropractic and osteopathic manipulation, etc. These things are all to more or less degree effective in helping rebalance the autonomic nervous system, but perhaps the most powerful tool at rebalancing the autonomic nervous system is fasting. Fasting works like rebooting the hard drive on a computer that has a corrupted hard drive. You reboot the system and lo and behold, oftentimes the problems are resolved. Fasting does a fabulous job at rebooting the systems of human beings. We've already mentioned the psychospiritual impact of fasting. It changes how you think and feel about yourself, which is why most major religions have a tradition of fasting incorporated into their teachings. Fasting enhances, not suppresses, the immune system. Some people think if you don't eat, your immune system will be suppressed, you'll be vulnerable to getting sick, whatever. The fact is, objective measures of immune system activity, helper killer T cell activity, neutrophil phagocytosis, everywhere you look, the objective markers tend to be enhanced during fasting. And perhaps most obvious of all is taste irritation. People don't like good food because they're addicted to the pleasure trap. They're addicted to greasy, fatty, slimy, processed foods, sugar, salt, oil, etc. So when they eat whole foods, they're not as stimulating. They don't feel appealing. They don't like it. They don't want it. Just like my gentleman that I mentioned that was living on triple cheeseburgers. After fasting, good food tastes good. You can get people willing to try to eat good food because now it's not disgusting, tasteless swill, but tastes good. So these are all mechanisms that we can see routinely in fasting that you really don't see as effectively in any other way. So to summarize what I said today, fasting decreases glucose and IGF-1, which is associated with aging, and it does it in a similar way to exercise. Interestingly enough, a lot of the improvements we see with exercise also happen in fasting. Fasting decreases blood pressure, heart rate, insulin, inflammation, oxidation, total microbial load. And fasting increases leptin, the satiety hormone, which is why after fasting, a lot of people that have these ravenous hungers find they can be satiated with whole natural foods. It increases insulin sensitivity, so the insulin starts to work. It increases the stress resistance and adaptation of cells. It increases autophagy, and it normalizes the gut microbiota. It stimulates B-cell immunity and reverses all the major abnormalities associated with metabolic syndrome. Fasting is truly the single most powerful interventive component in healing that I've had the privilege of getting to witness in over 32 years of practice. So if you'd like to learn more about how fasting works and what we think in terms of why the patients we see getting well are getting well, you can read our book, The Pleasure Trap, Mastering the Hidden Force That Undermines Health and Happiness. If you'd like to understand how to make good foods taste good, but still with simple recipes that are free of sugar, oil, and salt, you can take a look at our two books, the Health Promoting Cookbook or Bravo, which have excellent recipes. Again, even I can make these recipes. And none of them rely on any animal foods, any oil, salt, sugar, or products like gluten. So useful tools available everywhere, and I'd encourage you to take advantage of that. I'd also like to mention one other thing for any of you that do have questions, or if you'd like to know if this type of treatment might be helpful to you, you can go onto our website at healthpromoting.com, complete the registration forms, which gets me your medical history, and then call for a no-cost consult with me. And I'll be happy to help you decide whether or not there are things you can do that you're not already doing that might help you do what the body does best, and that's heal itself. Thank you so much for your attention. I'll look forward to hearing from you.